Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governance for Schools webinar. The focus of this morning's webinar is exploring the Ofsted Leadership and Management Judgement. And just before we get into the webinar, probably just a very quick word from our sponsors this morning. Smoothwall, who are the providers of digital monitoring and reporting software, are sponsoring these sessions that are being delivered by us today, and obviously want to express our gratitude to them. The webinar this morning is brought to you by Better Governor. My name is Steve Barker, that's me on the left, and I'm joined by my colleague Linda Waghorn, who is on the other line, hopefully. Hi there, Linda.
Good morning, everyone.
And Linda and I are both here representing Better Governor, and if you're new to these Governors for Schools webinars, we are delighted to be back presenting another webinar. We do several of these a year for Governors for Schools, and we're delighted to be able to do that. This is your webinar today, so please, if you have any questions or comments throughout the session, do please use the Q&A panel rather than the chat. We can only monitor one of them, I'm afraid. So if you don't mind using Q&A, Linda and I will do our best to be able to respond to those for you. Okay, so with no more ado, let's actually kick off with the aims of this morning's session. What we're going to do firstly is actually explore what that leadership and management judgment within the current Ofsted framework actually looks like, what's the structure of the judgment, etc. And then we're going to move into really clarifying the evidence base that Ofsted inspectors use when they're actually informing their judgment. So what are the sorts of aspects of school leadership and management that they focus on, type of questions that they ask, and also the areas of the school's work that they will be scrutinising. And what we always try and do in all of our webinars is actually come at this from how this actually forms part of our strategic overview of governance. But of course, what this is really about today, by focusing on the Ofsted judgment, is saying, what are those expectations? And they're not Ofsted's expectations, they're actually the government's expectations of effective governance. But how can we use what the Ofsted framework has in it to inform our own strategic overview of leadership and management in our own schools and trusts? But as I say, this is your session, so please, questions and comments would be very welcome at any time. Okay, so first of all, just wanted to put in a little bit of a backdrop of how Ofsted see this judgment. It's one of the four key judgments. Obviously, we've got quality of education, personal development, behaviour and attitudes, and leadership and management. And Ofsted describe in their own handbook the leadership and management judgment, as you can see in this box on the slide in front of you now. And they say it's about how leaders and governors or trustees ensure that the education that the school provides has a positive impact on all its pupils. It focuses on the areas where inspection and research indicate that leaders can have the strongest effect on the quality of education provided by the school. And then it goes on to list a whole load of important factors, which we're going to come back to in a moment. But just before I move off this slide, I was going to add here that when we talk about leadership and management, I'm not trying to teach anybody here to suck eggs, but it's important to recognise, of course, that governance is regarded by government, by the Department for Education, and therefore also by Ofsted, as part of leadership. So it says here leaders and governors or trustees. That's just the semantics of it. We are most definitely part of leadership, and therefore there are many, if not all aspects of this judgment that actually do relate to governance, although there are some that are specifically and explicitly focusing on governance. So if we think about what those important factors look like, Ofsted has actually specified 8 aspects which they believe leadership has the strongest effect or impact on. And of course, a lot of these are complementary. A lot of them there's a little bit of overlap in. Ofsted justify these 8 areas or 8 aspects on the basis that evidence from their inspection regimes over 30-odd years now, academic research, and certainly academic writing on the subject of leadership has actually demonstrated that these are the aspects that actually make most difference. First one of those, no real surprise, high expectations of pupils. I think most people will recognise that expectations, and we talk about ambition as well, and we'll say something more about that a little bit later, but expectations are at the forefront of a lot of the conversations that take place with between Ofsted inspectors and school leaders. The idea is that school leaders set that climate for everything that goes on in the school. And obviously the expectations of pupils, not just in terms of academic progress, but also in terms of things like their personal development and, of course, attendance. So all of those things where the school sets the climate is very much something that we would be expected to have Ofsted actually put the perhaps a microscope on. Focus on education is important. Sorry, Linda.
I'm just going to add on there in that high expectations of pupils, that there are specific aspects of our community, different parts of our community, and most schools will not have pupils from exactly the same sections of their community. And in the past, there has been some not exactly dumbing down of expectations, but not such high expectations of children from certain areas. One of the things that I'm thinking about specifically is the use of that technical language in school, the use of language specific to subject content in the curriculum or specific to their writing, that children from that particular area will struggle more because they have more challenges at home, or it's a disadvantaged area, or they've got English as a second language. Those are all things where this actually fits in really well. We have the same high expectations of all pupils, even though it may be slightly more difficult for those pupils to grasp some of those things. The expectation is that everybody comes out on an equal footing at the end of their time in our school.
Absolutely. Of course, that's reflected in number 7 there, high expectations for all. I mean, that focus is really on Ofsted's expectations in terms of equality and special educational needs and disabilities specifically. But Linda's absolutely right. That is a coverall. It's all aspects of our school community, and something that Linda and I have mentioned in many webinars in the past, of course, is that whole area of inclusion and making sure that equality means equality for all pupils in our schools. Second one is a focus on education, and this one is absolutely crucial because I just thought I'd share the exact wording from the framework here. It actually says the extent to which leaders focus their attention on the education provided by the school. There are many demands on leaders, but a great focus on this area is associated with better outcomes for pupils. And of course, things there that perhaps are diversions, temporary or perhaps slightly longer. Lots of schools in the past have spent a disproportionate amount of time considering joining a multi-academy trust or considering academy status. Lots of school leaders embroiled in complex building projects, etc. The point here is that our schools first and foremost exist so that our children and young people can learn. And if leaders don't focus on education and the educational priorities, evidence says that youngsters don't do quite as well. Similarly, professional development training for staff across the whole school has to be aligned to the curriculum, and Ofsted are looking for evidence that that happens. As I say, there's overlap with quite a few of these. And the next point, number 4, coherence and consistency across the school. That means in all things. As Linda said, this is about high expectations for all, but do we see those expectations consistently being demonstrated and those behaviours being lived across the school by all members of staff, all members of the school community each day and every day? Engagement with parents is important, of course. There's an element of proportionality here, and the Ofsted framework makes the point that the school is not expected to kowtow to every single parental wish and desire, but there is an element that says, it doesn't spell this out in quite this terminology, but parents are very much our customers from a school perspective, and therefore we want that sort of customer service ethos. We want parents to feel that they're included. We want parents to feel that they're supported in helping support their own children. So that's a key element.
Steve, there's a question.
Sorry, Linda.
There's a question on that point. David's asked, well, he said he's particularly interested in engagement with parents and how this might be evidenced. What would the inspectors expect to see in terms of that good quality engagement with parents?
Okay, well, we'll come on to perhaps a little bit more detail on that in a few moments. But I mean, generally, David, I would say they will use Parent View, which is Ofsted's own electronic online survey, and there are key questions that they ask in there. Some inspectors, and I say some because it's not a given anymore like it used to be a few years ago, some inspectors will put themselves out on the school gate at the beginning of the school day and at the end of the school day and actually talk to parents. The letter that goes out does actually invite parents, if they wish to speak to the inspector, to do so. That is rarely taken up, it has to be said. And of course, Ofsted always look at their own database. So if there have been any parental concerns, there have to be qualifying concerns, which means they're either about leadership and management, which of course is relevant to what we're talking about today, or they're about safeguarding, which again is obviously the prerogative of leadership. Those are qualifying complaints. Ofsted will look to see if there are any of those, and then they will feed that into their evidence trails and the evidence that they would look to gather for the strength of that engagement with parents. Workload and wellbeing have been part of the government's agenda for probably about 5 or 6 years or so now, and obviously that is now reflected since 2019 in the Ofsted framework as well. High expectations for all, I touched on before, that's really about the idea that schools are supposed to be the embodiment, and schools very much, in my view, have always been the embodiment of equality. We have to make sure that that equality of opportunity is there for all pupils, irrespective of their start point. And as Linda said, it's about those having the similar expectations for all of our pupils, irrespective of what they bring to school with them. And then also, this last one here, the understanding that of individual roles, and that includes us as governors, of course, and to make sure that in living out those roles, leaders, paid leaders, and governors are making a difference. They are improving school effectiveness. And of course, the evidence that Ofsted will look for there is to say, well, what have you done? What difference has it made? And that's very much a theme that runs through the inspection framework. So that's all I want to say about those 8 aspects there. Sorry, and at this stage, I'm going to hand over to Linda, who's going to talk to the next slides.
Thank you, Steve. So we're talking here now about how the inspection team will work during an inspection with the school concerned, and they will start with some face-to-face meetings with leaders. So they'll talk to senior leaders. They'll also talk with leaders, often called middle leaders or subject leaders, depending on the size of the school. Obviously, the bigger the school, the more layered or tiered effect there will be in terms of how those responsibilities are shared with others. But they will be looking for that evidence, as Steve said before, about the coherence and consistency of approach across the school, and that leadership is devolved in a way that is consistent and make sure that learning for all is shared, but also led well at every level. So clearly a head teacher, even with a small team of senior staff, can't do everything that needs to lead to all of those high expectations that Steve spoke in the previous slide. So these will be conversations, exploring things with those leaders, looking at the context of the school and looking at the learning, how the curriculum has been designed and how it is being implemented and shared across the school. It will also include meetings with governors and trustees. So if you're in a multi-academy trust, you can expect that there will be meetings with those at trust level, but also meetings with those local governors at that local board level. There isn't a lot of choice here about when that is, because the inspection team will come in and they'll do some of this work first, and then they'll want to see if when they talk to governance, this aligns with the pattern that they're seeing elsewhere. So usually you are given a time, and that is the time. As many governors, it's not just with individual chairs of governors, this will be meetings with governors who are available and can come and talk and discuss things with head teachers. In my own example this year, I'm a chair of governors. I was actually not in the country at the time. Mine was done by telephone. appointment, but my governors met in school the following morning at 8 o'clock. That was the time that they were given. So the meetings will follow the same kind of pattern to test that the evidence that they are seeing. We're looking at that coherence and consistency again. We'll talk about some of those questions as we move to some later slides. The inspectors will look at some documents. They will look at whether they line up with the picture they're forming of the school. They'll interview other members of staff, not just teachers, and pupils, because they'll follow some threads and trains of thought about certain areas that they're looking at. Usually there are curriculum areas that they identify right at the very beginning of the inspection. They'll follow those threads right the way through and down to that pupil level. Again, looking for that consistency and coherence across the whole school and testing what the school culture looks like and feels like. They'll record and report on evidence that they gather from that inspection process, and that will be part of what forms their judgment and what will appear in that final report. They'll look, as Steve said, at parent view. They'll talk to some parents, they'll talk to some staff. There is an invitation generally given to parents at the beginning that if anybody specifically wants to meet with the inspectors, they'll try and accommodate that to happen so they can follow any threads that are coming up there. And they'll look at the prior surveys that have been conducted with staff and with pupils and often with parents. So they'll look at how that consistency is building. And they'll look at something called pupil movement investigation. So we're very concerned nationally about the number of children who are missing from school, who have exited a school for one reason or another. And this is to make sure that the school is properly following up and making sure that those children, when they leave our school, go on somewhere and their education is continued. Is there anything you want to add there, Steve?
Sorry, I was struggling to find my unmute button. Yeah, just a question that just came up on the panel about how flexible are inspectors in terms of talking to governors and that recognition of, we've all got other things other than governance in our lives. And just to reiterate your thing, I was actually around for my school. One of my schools was actually inspected 3 weeks ago. I happened to be on my way to a conference, so the only time I could see the inspector was at 9:30 on the first day, which he did tell me was incredibly irregular. However, it was important that we spoke, and so that's what we did. The previous one, like Linda, I was actually on holiday. I was over in Singapore, so I had a massive time difference as well. But still, it was a virtual meeting, and it actually was to accommodate where I was, time, etc. So I think you'll find that Ofsted do want to speak to governors. They absolutely do, and they will be as flexible as they possibly can be. Other than that, no, we're fine, Linda.
Okay, and of course they can't accommodate multiple meetings with governors to suit a lot of different governors' needs. So generally they'll be a little bit more flexible with the chair, but they'll set their board offer as this is when we are available. If we move on to the next slide, Steve. When we're looking at some specific areas, when we're thinking about the school community, and so they will be looked at a slightly deeper level to ensure that those pupils are receiving that quality and consistency that we mentioned earlier. So they will look at the use of the pupil premium and any catch-up funding, specifically to look at how the school used that funding and the impact that funding had on helping those pupils to catch up with the expectations of their peers at certain levels and ages and stages. So the pupil premium is a piece of funding that is specifically given to schools to plan how they will support pupils who are disadvantaged, because there is, research has shown, there is a gap in their learning compared to children who are not from disadvantaged circumstances. There are other offers and training available on the pupil premium. If you don't know very much about that at the moment because you're a new governor, I would suggest that you look at that in a little bit more detail in another session, because it is a very fundamental and important part of making sure that all children do as well as they possibly can. They'll also look at the external support. So what support does your school bring into the school? What support does your school rely on to support pupils in different circumstances? And how effective is that in ensuring that those pupils are learning and progressing? They'll look at the way a school works in terms of providing its offer across all children in the school. So the specific point here about separation by sex is about how the equality of all pupils is maintained. So I'll give an example of that. When in my governance in Kent, we had a secondary school who found that girls were doing less well in science and maths, especially in the early years, in years 7 and 8. So they designed a programme to test whether, if they separated the girls from the boys for maths and science for specific lessons at the early part of their education in year 7, whether it would have an impact on their learning, and it did. So there is an expectation that all schools will teach all children and will make sure that they have an equality of offer across the whole curriculum. So they do not expect to see any separation by sex into any of these lessons, into any parts of the school life and in parts of the curriculum. But if there is a specific educational aspect that is being delivered in this way, it has to be carefully worked out and evidence that it is having impact and it is about learning. There is an expectation that protected characteristics, again, this is an equality-based, inclusive approach, making sure that all pupils understand that wider community and the legal framework about protected characteristics, and that they are gaining an understanding of the world and the wider aspect of education at later levels, or of the working world, when they'll have to work with a variety of different people, and understanding how that is part of the society around them, and how those protected characteristics are protected in law.
I suppose one of the things to actually, sorry, Linda, one of the things to actually add on that, of course, is that specifically now under the current framework that we have, there is a very real focus on how schools are actually meeting the statutory expectations within the guidance for relationship, sex and health education as well. That's where that actually comes into play in its most significant form. Thank you,
Steve. They'll also look at workload. This is still a really key part of making sure that, and governors will be acutely aware of this in your own schools, recruiting, retaining and supporting staff. There is a much higher incidence in society now of poor mental health. We're seeing that a lot with parent community, but also it's thinking about what the school has done over time to reduce the workload, take away some of those things that don't have real value in pupils' learning, and understanding as governors, and I think sometimes this isn't talked about enough at board meetings, understanding what the school has done and is doing to ensure that the workload is not too difficult, or the cause of staff poor mental health, absence and exit. In particular, we're thinking about leadership, thinking about your head teachers and your senior leaders' workload. And particularly in my school this year, I've had a few conversations with our head teachers. It's a smaller school and some of our senior leaders are new, and the head teacher rightly at the beginning has taken some of that responsibility more on their own shoulders. But it's now about conversations that we're having about, is that, are those staff now picking up more of that work? Are all staff feeling supported? Is there some kind of mental health first aider in school? Where does this support come from? Who do they talk to? What are staff meetings like? How does that come together to make sure that staff feel valued, supported, and they don't have too much work, that they feel overloaded with that?
And I think just on that one, Linda, before we move off workload, I've spent some of my time actually conducting external reviews of governance. I've done one recently where the head teacher had been set, I think it was 10 or 11 objectives for their under their appraisal by governors. It's things like that that we need to think about, but also on a general point, Linda and I always say to governors, what we should be expecting as governors, and it has a direct bearing on workload, is that head teachers and senior leaders should be sharing with us the work that they're doing, the data that they're using, etc., rather than preparing things specifically for governance, because that's hugely time consuming and probably not terribly productive. So I think it's worth reflecting, is that the way that you work as a governing body in your own schools? Or is there perhaps a tendency for governors to ask, well, can we look at the data in that particular way? Can we have this particular report? If it's not something that is actually being used in the school to lead the school forward, to actually improve progress, to improve performance, we should be asking the question, is it appropriate for us to ask it? Sometimes it might be, but I think it's something we should be reflecting on.
And on that point, when we're doing our monitoring visits as governors, think about what we are expecting those subject leads or senior leaders to do with us, not only about how much time they're spending with us, but what we expect them to prepare for us to see. Because really, this is us looking for evidence that already exists, being aware of the things that are on the wall, in classrooms, in corridors. There are lots of observational things that we can do in a monitoring visit before we even get to the point of having a conversation. And I would suggest it should be more conversationally based. And as Steve said, relying on your existing knowledge of things that you have already seen in terms of records and data sets at board meetings, rather than expect them to show you that and go through that all over again. So we need to do a little bit of preparation ourselves, and that will help with that workload expectation.
We've got a question on the panel. Sorry, Linda, we've got a question on the panel, which I think is probably worth bringing in here just before we move on. Sorry, you haven't put your first name, but somebody called G has actually put we tend not to give people surnames for obvious reasons, but thank you for the question. I think it's a really good one. On the subject of inclusivity, are inspectors likely to be aware that schools that work harder to support pupils with special educational needs and acquire a positive reputation in the area also incur additional financial burdens, since high needs funding does not entirely cover provision? I say it's a good question. I think it is a good question because it is an issue. Sadly, the answer is probably no. Ofsted will recognise the length to which schools go to promote and to deliver inclusion. Of course they will. And I think I mentioned one of the schools where I'm chair was inspected a few weeks ago, and in fact our report was published the day before yesterday, and the Ofsted inspectors have said some very nice things about how inclusive we are. There's some nice quotes from parents, but unfortunately, Ofsted's remit really isn't anything to do with finance, so they're not going to join up the two. But certainly there is recognition that there are schools in the country now where reputation, for whatever reason, develops that this is a school that does work incredibly hard to meet the needs of those children. And so it is recognised by Ofsted, absolutely.
And I think the special needs community, those parents are very good at sharing with other parents that are coming into the school system where they think good practice in schools exists. And then those schools that do it well become a beacon for other children with similar sorts of needs. And yeah, certainly that is the case in the school where I'm chair. And the funding doesn't equate to the provision that those children need very often. We do the best that we possibly can with the funding that we have, but it sadly, in many cases, it's not as much as we might need to do that job as effectively as we want to, especially if we've also got falling roles, which we have in my area. So we don't have the full classes that give us some of that funding in the first place. So it's a challenging one. Funding is challenging on a number of levels. The last slide that I want to cover on this, the last aspect on this particular slide, is that one of safeguarding. And we can't underestimate here the importance of of that particular aspect. And I want to say a little bit more about that on the next slide, if I may. So if we move on to the next slide, Steve, we'll talk about this as a specific subject area. So this is a judgment that the inspectors will form a view of from the moment they get out of their vehicles and come onto our school site. And where safeguarding is judged as ineffective, and it's either effective or ineffective, it isn't a graded judgment 1 to 4 like the other aspects are in turn. If they see anything that they are concerned about, they will start to go down that route and dig deeper until they uncover what it is that they've seen, and whether it is part of a wider problem of safeguarding throughout the school. So it can start with an incident they see at the school gate. It can start with a lack of single sexual rhetoric being up to date. It can be behaviour of pupils. It can be a whole range of different things. But if safeguarding is ineffective, it will lead to a judgment of inadequate for leadership and management, because they're saying that the leadership of the school, governors included, have not paid enough attention to systems, practice and culture in order to make sure that this isn't the case in this school. So that culture is so important. Your policy is your rules, and your safeguarding policies will cover a wide range of areas, because safeguarding is a huge subject. And again, if you don't know very much about safeguarding, this is an area for you as a governor to look at in a separate session or learning. But it is about having that policy that is context related, so it understands the risks in your school community. It is about sharing information. It is about collecting information, understanding the circumstances of pupils and your community, and taking appropriate actions to both protect children who might be more vulnerable and to prevent any of those risk factors increasing, and to take further actions with outside agencies to make sure that those children are kept to the highest possible safeguarding aspects. And we see incidents in the papers, sadly, every week. There was an incident last week in a Folkestone school at a nursery where a 2-year-old child was found in the street outside the nursery. And of course, that would be the sort of thing that nobody would say is acceptable and would lead to an ineffective judgment. It can be smaller things like medicines and all sorts of things that are part of your policy. Your policy is not a living, breathing part of the culture. Then it will lead to exposure to safeguarding risks. And they'll establish this by talking to pupils. They'll look at how allegations have been handled. They'll look at and suggest, looking at things that have been improved over a period of time. So what improvements have you put in place since the last inspection? Certainly the medicine issue was a live issue in my school some years ago, and improvements have been made. They'll look at whether those are adequate and effective, and they'll look for, as I said, evidence of ineffective safeguarding in everything they do. All those other things that we've talked about, then that safeguarding hat never comes off. They're aware of everything all of the time, and they can take that further at any point.
I think a good thing to just point out here as well, Linda, is this area has changed a little bit. Ofsted have tweaked this really as part of the reaction and response to the sad events in the school in Caversham earlier this year, where unfortunately a head teacher took their life. The relevance of what the school does is paramount, and Ofsted now are saying that they will look into a lot of detail. So the idea of looking at allegations and how they've been handled, the idea of looking at improvements, and even that last one about ineffective safeguarding, there are gradations of that now. So there are minor things talked about. So one of the paragraphs in the handbook talks about minor safeguarding improvements, and they're things that relate to administrative errors. So we've had the issue about minor omissions on the single central record for many, many years. But now they're saying, well, just because there isn't a date on a particular piece of paper in a child's safeguarding file, the school doesn't file isn't inadequate, etc. Because actually, if there's a post-it somewhere else that has that, it can easily be rectified. So there is a more perhaps considerate response to this, but as Linda said, paramount importance in schools is still safeguarding, and that will never go away.
So let's move on and from safeguarding and talk a little bit about how the judgment is linked to these grade descriptors. So looking at a good judgment, there is an expectation that all schools should be at least good. So we're looking here at making sure that what we see in our own schools is at least meeting these grade descriptors. And if you look down the page here, we've talked about some of these already about our school leaders and our subject leaders. We go right the way down here. We look at governors and trustees. We'll talk a little bit more about understanding their role in a moment, but important here, and linking back to what we've said about safeguarding, but also all those other legal duties that a school has as part of the law, that governors and trustees are responsible for ensuring that, not operationally doing it themselves, but ensuring that the school fulfills its statutory duties. We're talking here, they make a specific example of the Equality Act and other duties in relation to prevent and safeguarding. And this will also bring into play all of those things about inclusion, about making sure that the right policies and processes are in place to protect and support pupils. And this is an area which we should have in our fore when we are looking at our agendas and our meetings, the reports that we receive. Have we got a framework for ensuring that we meet these responsibilities, that there is time given in our agendas to talk about how our school meets these responsibilities, and we hold the school to account for that. Did you want to say anything else there? Right, so let's look at how we look at in an outstanding school. This is where we are, our own aspirations, if you like, as governors for our leadership and management. So it meets all of those expectations for good that on the previous slide. But in addition, we've got leaders who really focus on effective professional development. And that means that everything that is designed in school is about meeting the needs of our pupils, so that over time there is a consistent body of knowledge that is built up, and that all staff are on the same journey together, supported in their individual aspirations and expectations, and it consistently translates to improvements in teaching of the curriculum. So we have new teachers joining the schools all the time. We have young teachers, we have more experienced teachers over time. This is about bringing that all together in that culture where everybody learns together from each other with good quality CPD that is linked back to the learning and the teaching and the curriculum. And leaders that, again, develop this culture so that they have meaningful engagement, so that there is a partnership aspect to this. And it feels like a place where at all levels, everybody is working for the good of each other, and issues are easily and quickly identified, and they are dealt with appropriately and quickly. And this means that open culture where ideas for improvements are encouraged, and good ideas are followed up and are put into place. And as a result of that, staff report and feel well supported, and well-being issues are minimised because they feel part of an organisation that is entirely supportive and educationally focused.
couple of questions on the panel just before we move on, Linda, if I may. I've got a question from David here. Thanks, David. David is saying, clear vision and strategy. Is this shown specifically by documentation, or will inspectors form a view even if there is no SIP, which I'm assuming means school improvement plan, in place? The answer to the first part of the question, they will form a view based on a whole number of factors. They'll look on, don't forget, they will always look at the school website before they arrive in the school anyway, and there should be something there about the vision and the overall strategic direction of the school. If there isn't a school improvement plan or school development plan in place, I think that says a lot about the strategic focus of the school. And I'm not at all convinced that that would go down very well with an inspector team, because you would have to have a very consistent approach from the head teacher, the governing body, all other leaders, who can all articulate with clarity what the school's priorities for improvement are. So the absence of a school improvement plan is a bit of an own goal, in my view. I hope that answers your question, David. Then we've got another question from Dave saying, is there more governor-oriented documentation that forms something like a checklist for governors for ensuring that everything meets all these requirements? I don't know about you, Linda, but I would point to certainly compliance aspects being more in the domain of the clerk of the governance professional to actually assist in actually the governing body making sure that they are compliant. There are resources on the DFE website, like what maintained schools must publish online, what academies must publish online, etc. And of course, there's a list of statutory policies. So I don't know. I mean, we have produced governor fact sheets that governors can actually use for inspections, but ultimately it's not just for use in inspection, it's more of an aid memoir. Linda and I don't think we've said it this morning yet, always come from the position we don't prepare for Ofsted, we ensure that everything that we do provides the best possible education and care for our pupils. Therefore all of these things should be in place anyway. But certainly I would say have a chat with your clerk stroke governance professional and make sure that as a governing board you know all aspects of your compliance, so you can ensure that you do actually have them in place. I don't know if there's anything you would add to that, Linda.
I just combine it with the previous question, because compliance is a big aspect of that. Things happen in the school, reports and certain things that our outside agencies need happen at the same time every year, and therefore it should be fairly easy to create a planner. And I know Steve and I are great fans of an annual planner that feeds into agenda, so you make sure as governors you see those things at the right time of the year. The other aspect of that is, as a board, you are focused on school improvement. So you need, as governors, if I asked you the question, what are the 4 priorities that your school is focusing on this year, you would probably go to the school improvement plan to support your answer. And this is what we're working on, this is how we are doing it. Those things need to be on your agendas. They need to be the things that you talk about under the head teacher's report in particular. How is it going? How do we know? What more can we do? So I think those 2 things combine. So meaningful agendas that map out what you as governors are talking about at any given time of the year are usually a combination of following the school improvement plan or business plan and the compliance aspects on the calendar at that time of the year, plus any other additional areas where you're looking at things. We've got an organisational issue going on in our school, part of a wider map. That is part of a consultation document, and that's on our agendas as well. It's, for me, I think it's about simplifying the business as usual so that you have got a framework where you consider these things and you consider all of these things over the year. We talk about safeguarding in particular. It's on your agenda as a standing item, but what do you talk about during your meeting? So I think if you've got a good framework, and remember, any governor can suggest things for the agenda. You can talk about your own agendas and your own governance organisation with your clerk, with your chair. If you've got a good framework for practice, then you will begin to be able to have a confident conversation about your lived experience as a governor in your school. And I think that's the best preparation for Ofsted. Let's move on and just think here, if we've talked about what are the grade descriptors for good and outstanding, and those are our aspirations. The grade descriptors for requires improvement are the opposite. Just to leadership and management are not good, safeguarding is effective. So we've got effective safeguarding here, but leadership and management needs to be improved. And we need to take our part in that as governors if we are in a school. And I have been in a number of schools in the past where I have joined a board to be part of the improvement required here. And it is very clear those areas of improvement and what they are and what needs to happen next. So our aspirations are for us to be at least good, and with elements of outstanding, that's what we would be working towards.
And
So
it's
let's
probably,
have a,
it doesn't need saying here, Linda, but I think just to say that obviously if safeguarding is not effective, that immediately means serious weaknesses or special measures, of course.
yes, you wouldn't gain a requires improvement judgment for that. So let's look at governance in a little bit more detail. And this is from the inspection handbook itself. So they'll look at the evidence of the impact of the Board of Governors or the Board of Trustees and the Board of Trustees. So I'm in a multi-academy trust, 5 schools. Our inspection in May of this year, local board looked at in detail, and also one of the questions that we were asked was around our engagement with the trust. So there will always be a trust engagement in looking at governance, because depending on the scheme of delegation, some or most, in some cases, of the delegated responsibilities will be held at board level, and some will be delegated at somewhat trust level rather, and some will be delegated down to the individual board. So it's important that we look at that as a whole. The governance handbook is very clear about our role as a governing body, and we should be confident, which means we need to read, research, understand, and participate in governance. It is strategic and not operational. So we're not looking at the individual school detail. We are looking at the plans, which is where I would think your vision and your strategic priorities against that vision are vitally important, and they should be laid out, in my view, so that we can understand what we're holding the school to account for, and therefore we can see the reports, we can have that oversight of those reports, we can ask questions to develop our own understanding and assure ourselves that both the educational and the financial performance that we're seeing is up to that at least good standard and providing a good education for all our pupils. They'll explore how we carry out those functions. They'll look at how those documents are developed and shared with us, how we participate in those discussions. So our minutes, our monitoring visit reports will all form part of that. They'll ask us questions about what we know about the curriculum, and they'll look at and consider whether our work is supportive of and has impact on driving the school forward to provide that high quality education for all pupils. And then there's that statutory bit. We've talked about compliance. How do we do that? What evidence is in the minutes? What are our conversations in terms of it's safeguarding, for example? We will all have a lead governor that has a particular deeper knowledge of safeguarding. How is that shared with the board? How do we know? How is our knowledge improved? What do we know and do about ensuring that pupils don't get pulled into areas under, for example, the prevent duty, and also drugs, grooming, and those areas. What all aspects of safeguarding are looked at, and then if they're when they're looking at how we work as a board, they are not expecting to see any particular shape or any particular structure or a list of things that we do and how we do it. It is whether what we do is effective in driving the school forward. So it matters less about how it is done. It is more about the evidence that it is being done to at least that good standard.
Couldn't agree with you more on that, Linda. And that is a question that has just come up, which I think is relevant to actually float in at this stage. Thanks for the question, Martin. Martin's asking, do you think a school can cover all these responsibilities on 3 governor meetings a year plus learning walks?
I think 3 governing meetings a year is a bit on the thin side if you are not supported by a committee structure. So some schools will have 3 full board meetings, but they might have an education committee and a committee focused on the financial aspect of the school. I think that then creates a broader set of meetings, and those minutes will feed into those 3 meetings a year, plus your monitoring visits. If you are a local governing board of an academy, you might have much fewer responsibilities. You may have no financial responsibilities at all. So your entire focus might just be on the educational offer for pupils, in which case, again, possibly 3 meetings a year and good quality learning walks or monitoring visits would fit that. I think it's very hard, and it comes back to this last comment on this current slide, not expected to construct or review a list of duties. I think it depends on how much delegated responsibilities you have and what your structure is in order to cover all of these areas that have been delegated to you. Without knowing a little bit more, I would just exercise a little bit of caution on my view there. But if you are a school with full delegated responsibilities and you only have 3 meetings a year, I think that is quite a challenge. I don't know if you've got anything more you want to add, Steve.
I would agree 100%. I'm a great fan, and I know Linda works this way in some of her schools as well, in the flat structure that is committee free. I think that would be impossible. I would always expect there to be at least 6, if not 7 meetings a year under that way. But again, the important thing is, as Linda said a few minutes back, this is all about the impact of what we do. If you believe that your structure allows you total compliance and the ability to create evidence that governance is working and making a difference in the school, it doesn't matter how you structure it. But I'm with Linda. The personal view is that, just 3 meetings a year, unless that's supported by a committee structure, doesn't seem that effective to me. Thanks, Linda.
It would be difficult to cover all the things that I would want to discuss in only 3 meetings a year, given that I'd want to talk about those monitoring, those learning walk visits and the reports as well. It would be challenging to fit that into 3 meetings. So I think if we could follow that up, maybe thinking about some of the questions that we might be asked, that might actually then start reflecting back into, well, what do we do and how do we know? Where have we got that information from? What evidence would we point to show that we can talk confidently about that? And I think this is based on this particular set of questions is based on some of the questions from live inspections this year. So if you were asked, what are the strengths of the school's curriculum? Would you be confident in being able to have a conversation with the inspectors, with your other governors, about what you understand are the strengths of the school's curriculum and how you know that? Would you know the other parts of the offer that fit around the taught offer of curriculum in school? So how is it enriched? What other opportunities do children in your school have to have enrichment activities, visits outside of the school, extracurricular clubs and offers? One of the things we've looked at in our school as a trust, we have a trust-wide emphasis this year on disadvantaged pupils. And one of the things that we have looked at and researched in each of those schools, or the senior team have, is about the number of children in receipt of pupil premium who don't or can't access the enrichment part of the curriculum, particularly the after-school clubs. And as a result of what those children have told us, there is a goal to make sure every child in the school participates in at least one enriched part of the curriculum over this year, and then each school is targeted with ensuring that happens. So some of those things you could talk confidently about, and explain to Ofsted what is happening in your school and why. How do you know about the curriculum? Where do you talk about that in your meetings? You could have had presentations, it's an enhanced offer at your meeting by the lead of the curriculum in your school or your head teacher. You could have evidence from your learning walks or monitoring visits that feed into that. You might have had a discussion particularly around subjects where you are trying to make some improvements this year. In terms of learning walks, this is a very broad term and can mean different things to different schools. So what is the purpose of a learning walk? Is it a learning walk that happens for the benefit of staff in school and governors are invited, or linked governors are invited to participate and observe in that? Or is it a learning walk at the other end of the spectrum where it is all governors invited in to walk around the school so that they can learn about what is happening in school as a collective group of governors? So I think it is something that means different things in different schools, but what is the impact of that? If you are observing, is that part of your wider responsibilities for monitoring and goes into a report? If you are as a whole governing body, does it lead to a better quality discussion at your next meeting? Does it lead to improved knowledge about the curriculum or about the learning offer? So I think some of that will be, you'll need to tease out. So what have I learned? What difference does it make? Am I wiser? Am I more informed? Do I ask better quality questions? Can I see that there is evidence that school is moving towards the goals that it set itself in terms of its strategic priorities?
We've had one or two questions on the panel as we've gone through the session this morning, Linda. Governors saying, well, how do I know what I should be doing on the curriculum? How do I know what I should be doing on inclusion, on attendance, etc.? I think it's worth saying that these questions that are here now, you can see there's certainly a thread here. They're all interlinked and one question follows the other. But a lot of those perhaps more detailed answers to the questions are contained in webinars that we've done for Governors for School historically. So if you go onto the Governors for School website, you will find that there was a webinar earlier in the year, 9th of March to be precise, on pupil premium. There was one that we did in January, is governance ready for Ofsted? So there's a lot of resource out there that goes into far more detail. We're talking about leadership and management explicitly today, and as Linda said, this is really, and again, this isn't about what we know about the curriculum specifically. This is about how do we know that the curriculum is being well led and well managed in our schools? Part of that can be overlaid with what we know because of our in-depth involvement as governors, but don't forget, ultimately, governance is about a strategic overview. It's not about getting involved in deep dives. It's not about becoming experts on the curriculum. We have people in our schools who are paid to do that. But again, having that strategic overview and knowing what that strategic overview is in terms of that chain that Linda's just described, I think is absolutely essential.
And I think it starts with the reports, again, back to that mapping out of your year as a governor, as a board, mapping out meaningful agendas and making sure that feeding into those meaningful agendas are the reports or presentations or a combination of the two that give you that information. Particularly on behaviour, starts with our approval of the behaviour policy, but then about the reports that we get back from our school that tells us about behaviour generally and whether our policy is being effective, but also about how that continuum, and there is a separate offer in terms of learning about behaviour exclusions, suspensions, but this is about understanding that there is a plan for policy, procedure, management of behaviour, positive behaviour, because we're expecting that all pupils will achieve and progress in school. And linked to behaviour is, are pupils attending regularly and on time? Because we cannot get pupils to where we want them to be in terms of their learning if they are both have those behaviours for learning attributes. Part of our offer is supporting those children to be there, and they're attending on time and regularly. So these things go together, because if they're not in school and behaving well for learning, we cannot then make sure that they access that curriculum offer. And then we've talked a little bit before about head teacher work-life balance and avoiding that workload pressure. There will clearly be at some times of the year more pressurized times than others, and I think it is a responsible governing body that plans its year's activities aware of those pressure points around the year. There are times of the year when data is collected and analysed and will lead to a report to governors. Is it at the right time of the year? There are times in the summer term when it has already been quite a busy year, to then ask, oh, because there's not much for us to do as governors, let's have a little project going on in school where we as governors can, do a little bit more work with senior leaders. It's probably not an appropriate time of year. So we both have an oversight as a governing board, particularly with the chair, around head teacher work-life balance, and you will be asked that if you are a chair of governors and an Ofsted inspection. But also it's about us as governors avoiding putting extra pressures on our head teacher. So let's move on to what governors need to know. We've talked about some of these things already, so this is really just a reflection on understanding where we have got to in our discussion this morning. Evidence relating to the other three judgments that come together to pull that final report together. We're looking at safeguarding and how the school leaders monitor what it tells us as governors. How do we know where is the evidence, and how do we feed back what we've discussed in our monitoring, and how that comes together as a partnership, that leadership and management partnership of school leaders and governing bodies working well together. My head teacher always says to me she thrives on the challenge of talking to governors, because it makes her think about things in a different way to the operational way that she works in school. So it should be part of that positive culture. What parents, pupils and staff think about the school, those will be primarily from those surveys and the things that we talked about earlier. Compliance, particularly equality and inclusion, and then how effective we are as a governing board in looking over those aspects. I don't know if you've got any more questions on the panel, Steve?
No, I think we haven't at the moment. Just to say, folks, if there are any other questions, please do send them across and we will actually get back to you remotely. We have actually tipped past the witching hour, so I'm sorry. Hopefully we've gone a little bit over this morning just because we've had so many questions, but Linda and I love that, so thank you very much indeed for sending all those questions across. And to say, if there are any more, put them on the panel and we will respond to you directly. But that just leaves us to say thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. We hope you found this session useful. Please come back next time. We've got another Better Governor session for governors for schools coming up in December. And I believe details for that are actually going to be published very shortly. That's going to be on performance data. We look forward to seeing you again, but in the meantime, enjoy the remainder of your day. It's pretty grey and miserable where I am, but I hope it's more pleasant where you are. Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.